This is Demi Birchett's 3.2 Aggression assignment.
There has been a lot of violent and aggressive behaviours that have been performed in sport recently, especially in the World Cup football game where Uruguay played Italy. In the first half, Luis Suarez launched a late, clumsy challenge on Andrea Pirlo, upending the player as Pirlo tumbled. A flailing forearm struck Suarez around the ear. He was frustrated and appeared hurt, choked at the behaviour of Pirlo. Around 40 minutes later, the score still 0-0, Suarez committed a similar act. But this time the catalyst was something more unusual. We saw Luis Suarez make a vicious attempt on Chiellini, where he appeared to bite him on his shoulder. At first it was missed by the referee, but it was later brought to FIFA's attention that this was Suarez's third biting incident in his career. This resulted in FIFA's disciplinary committee to prevent the player from entering any football stadium during a ban of 4 months. Today we are joined by sports psychologist Demi Birchett, who specialises in aggression in sport, to explain these increasingly common behaviours. So Demi, what do you think of the incident?
Yes, this is just one of the many situations which are becoming more common in our sports today. We know that the media capitalise on the sensationalism of elite players or spectator aggression, and these incidents are reported and exploited in the news regularly. I agree that this behaviour was an aggressive act with a clear intent to cause harm, but in sport, aggression is a characteristic that can have negative as well as positive effects on performance. Suarez had clearly become frustrated at Pirlo's example of hostile aggression, where he acted outside the rules of the sport. So this seemed to act as a cue in order to increase Suarez's arousal and therefore his aggression, which he clearly couldn't control. So he released this physically by harming his opponent. In a statement, FIFA said the disciplinary committee had come to the conclusion that Suarez had breached the code of an act of unsporting behaviour towards another player. I think the decision made was the right one, and the harsh penalty administered is sending out a clear message that these aggressive acts cannot be tolerated in society and sport. This is even filtered down to as far as the spectator, where clubs have identified and given lifetime bans in order to try and show a strong presence. I think this is the right way forward, especially to make sure all officials and upcoming performers abide by the rules strictly and consistently to try and stamp out the issues.
Here we also have an example of a boxer punching his opponent. This performer seems to be displaying lots of aggression like the Suarez incident.
No, this is not what aggression is. It is often used ambiguously or misused by individuals, especially coaches, athletes, and particularly the media, to describe certain behaviours. Berkowitz 1993 summarised that in order to be classified as aggressive behaviour, it has to meet two factors, which is whether the behaviour is being directed at another individual with the intent to cause some form of physical harm, or if the behaviour is likely to have the potential to cause harm to others due to being goal-directed, and whether the attempt to inflict harm will be successful. Also, other sports psychologists have slightly different definitions, such as Gill in the 1980s said that aggression is a behaviour with the goal of harming or injuring another being, who is motivated to avoid such treatment. Both of these definitions propose the idea that aggression is always a way of inflicting harm on others, and that the player has a goal which is directed at causing harm to another person. But it is not always the case, as there are different types of aggression that outline that there are significant differences.
So what criteria then does aggressive behaviour have to meet in order to be considered aggressive?
Well, Jill then further developed her definition and identified some criteria to be able to categorise aggressive behaviours. The first criteria is that aggression is a form of physical or verbal behaviour. So by saying horrible things to someone and physically causing harm is aggressive because it has intent. However, having negative thoughts about someone or becoming angry at something is not classified as aggressive behaviour. The second concept is that to be aggression, it must involve harm or injury, which is physical but can also be psychological harm. An example of this is trying to humiliate or make a teammate look weaker than the rest of the team, and this can be seen as aggression. The third is that the harm is directed to another human being, because most performers become frustrated when they lose or something doesn't quite work out for them. So an example is they may throw their tennis racket to the floor in rage against the decision made by the umpire, or even the loss of a set or the whole match. This wouldn't be classified as aggression under Gill's criteria because it is not intending to cause harm to someone else. It is just happening out of anger, which is different to aggression. However, kicking an opponent or biting them would be considered aggressive behaviour, so Suarez's biting attempt would be classified as aggression because he intended to inflict harm on his opponent. The last point is that aggression is intentional, so it is performed to cause harm and not be accidental. As normally, if the act is intentional, this may be made clear to the other players and the referee in order to gain an advantage or cheat their team to win.
So if this example wasn't an aggressive act, then what actually is aggression?
Well, there isn't just one type of aggression that is used to determine violent behaviours. Silver, 1983, proposed that in sport, aggression can be categorised into two categories. These are hostile aggression and instrumental aggression, and they have similarities and differences which are important to understand. Hostile aggression is based on the idea to cause harm to another individual and is fueled by anger. The majority of the time it is outside the rules of the sports. Whereas instrumental aggression is not to harm someone and it is in fact to achieve a sporting outcome, but there is still a risk that a player can get hurt as the intention is there to stop the player, so it is an aggressive act but is directed at a different source. So a sporting example of instrumental aggression is in rugby, where a player initiates a vicious tackle on his opponent in an attempt to win the ball. This isn't an example of aggression because the player is not intending to cause harm to the opponent, but is directing the aggression in an attempt to win the ball, and therefore is playing by the rules of the game. Whether a player doesn't want to cause harm, there is always a chance that a player may get injured as the tackles can be aggressive. Colomb and Pfister, 1998, conducted a study to investigate aggression in elite athlete sports. They found that experienced athletes demonstrated more instrumental aggression, which athletes use in order to gain an advantage in sport, while hostile aggression was less frequently used because athletes found it easier to control aggression with self-control techniques. A sporting example of hostile aggression is a bowler bowling a bouncer deliberately to the batsman in an attempt to try to affect their concentration, and this has been performed in past games to try to affect their performance in the game. This shows a clear intent to cause harm or to deliberately affect the opponent's performance in order to gain an advantage.
If aggression isn't always intentional and to cause harm to another player, is there a definition that explains how we can reduce the aggression?
There are some sports psychologists that agree that aggression can actually improve performance, like Widmeyer and Birch, 1984, proposed the idea of assertive behaviour. According to Bredemeyer, 1994, he said that assertive behaviour can improve performance and is where a player will play within the rules of the sport at a very high intensity, but will have no intention to harm an opponent. Under this definition, assertion, which is also known as channeled aggression, is any behaviour that has no intention to cause harm, as the aggression is channeled and directed somewhere else, but not to an individual. An example of this could be an aggressive tackle in rugby, as the tackle is strictly within the rules of the sport, and therefore, although it is vicious and forceful, which means there is a risk that the individual may get hurt, this is how the athlete makes their presence present by giving their 100% effort. But this definition differs from the others because the athlete has a sense of self-control and therefore can channel this aggression to reduce it or direct it at a different source. For example, in an attempt to regain possession and win the ball back in hockey, the player may attempt an aggressive tackle in an aim to try to prevent the player from scoring, and so they can push the ball back into their team's possession. Assertion and aggression are often confused and associated with each other, as a study conducted by Lang and Jabalski 1976 showed that people mistake assertiveness for rudeness and aggressive acts. Aggression is also misused in sports commentary as it is in the wrong context, because the performer may actually be showing forceful behaviour rather than aggression, according to Wiggins-James 2006.
Can the nature of the sport, like where it has originated from, actually cause players to be more aggressive?
It is especially important in this next definition to realise that acts of aggression may be interpreted differently depending on the nature of the sport. According to Wiggins-James et al. 2006, the idea of sanctioned aggression is any behaviour that an individual has that has a clear intent to cause harm, but it is within the rules of the sport. An example of this is in contact sports like wrestling or boxing, because causing physical pain to another opponent is a vital part of the rules of the sport. But for a player in netball to kick or punch an opponent, it is deemed unacceptable, as it is against the rules of the sport due to it being a non-contact sport. So the player shouldn't come into contact at any point of the match. If a netball player was to purposely hurt another player, there should be consequences and punishments for them which are implemented both by the referee in the game and the coach off the court. The opposite of sanctioned aggression is unsanctioned aggression, which is where the behaviour has a clear intent to cause harm but doesn't comply to the rules of the sport. An example of unsanctioned aggression is in rugby, when a player performs a high tackle where they grab the opponent by the neck and pull them to the ground. This goes against the rules of the sport, and therefore the player should be punished by the referee. An example of this is being sent to the sin bin, which is where players are sent when they receive a yellow card from the referee, who believe their behaviour was serious or has shown indiscipline. This is a technique used by the referee to allow the players to be punished and understand that their behaviour is unacceptable. It is also used to reduce arousal by removing them from the situation so they can take some time to calm down before they come back to the field of play, in an attempt to stop them from repeating their misdemeanour.
Do you agree that the more experience the sports performer has in their fields, the less likely they are to show any form of aggression?
Well, no, actually the experience of the player has no relevance at all to a player and whether they will exert aggression, and it is more to do with the environment and the personality of the individual which can influence the aggression. There are several theories which can explain why performers become more aggressive.
So where does this aggression come from according to the theories?
Well, the first theory is the trait or instinct theory, and this is the idea that aggression is a natural characteristic that all humans have, an aggressive instinct which is innate. The idea arose from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and the idea of the survival of the fittest, which means in order to survive we had to be aggressive. Aggression, according to this theory, builds up inside an individual, and therefore it is natural that we need to release it. And sport and exercise has been shown to be an acceptable place to release this aggression, which is known as catharsis. According to this theory, an individual who is aggressive will be aggressive in their everyday life, and from the causes we have discussed, will result in the individual exhibiting this aggressive behaviour. An example of this is in netball. An individual keeps getting blown up by the umpire for footwork violations, while the opponent marking them keeps performing contacts but not being blown up for it as it is not seen. Both teams are of a very similar level and the score is very close. The players are exhausted and are finding it difficult. The same player keeps getting blown up footwork and starts to become more aggressive. According to this definition, the player will reach a point where they cannot contain their aggression and may start to contact their opponent and cause physical harm in response to the hostile aggression. This is because they are frustrated with the umpire's actions and may feel it is unjust towards them, so therefore they take it on themselves to punish their opponent. Another example is a boxer. Under this theory, the boxer will be aggressive to fight the player because they are aggressive in everyday life, according to this theory, because they are considered to be born with these aggressive traits which are unchangeable.
That is quite a bold statement, that sport performers will be aggressive all the time because that's the way they are born.
I agree, and for those reasons it has been greatly criticised as it doesn't account for the situational factors that can increase or decrease aggression, as because our personalities are deemed as stable and unchangeable, so therefore it doesn't account for individual differences in that not all people are born to be aggressive, or even if people are aggressive, it doesn't mean they will be aggressive in all ways of life. This has been shown that aggressive performers often don't show the same characteristics in society away from their sport. Another limitation of this theory is the idea that it doesn't account for the idea that aggressive behaviour isn't just innate, but is linked to culture and is often learned when animals and humans had to survive. It doesn't take into consideration the different factors which contribute to aggressive behaviour and act as cues.
So then how do we become aggressive from our environment? What are the factors?
Well, the social learning theory is the complete opposite to trait theory and says that we are not aggressive based on our traits we inherit, but we become aggressive because we learn through observing others who demonstrate aggressive behaviour, which makes us adopt it also. According to Bandura's social learning theory, he suggested that all behaviours are learned and nurtured through the environment in which we surround ourselves in.